Greetings, comrades, and I hope you're ready for something just a little bit different. I'm sure it may come as no surprise to many of you that I'm a big fan of the Song of Ice and Fire series as created by George R. R. Martin. I find his world to be extremely interesting, drawing from enough historical points of interest to remain familiar to us, yet wholly unique. Now that the new season of House of the Dragon has come and gone, I personally find the discourse around the show to be fascinating. One of the things I love about the way George R. R. Martin writes his characters is that there is no wholly good or bad guys. All characters have shades of good and evil. Some were more moral or good than others, some were more evil than others, but all of them have that moral ambiguity within them. And I feel this is more evident within House of the Dragon than actually the main series. The Greens and the Blacks are both morally dubious in achieving their ends. And I want to talk about which side has the best claim to the Iron Throne. I haven't really seen someone try and make an objective case in this regard. What I often see is people clearly biased towards one side or another, arguing why they are correct. But that's not necessarily what I'm trying to do here today. What I'm hoping is to take a much more objective approach and look at who truly has the strongest claim to the Iron Throne in this complicated political web that is the Dance of the Dragons. So if any of you are viewing this and are not regular channel watchers, I am a Song of Ice and Fire super nerd. I've read all the books from the main series, all the prequels, all the side stories, absorbed all the lore of Westeros from its infancy in the Age of Heroes to where we are now, which is waiting for George to get off his fat sorry ass and tell us what the hell is going to happen. I've seen both the television series and read the companion Fire and Blood prequel. Unless they change something drastic within the television series, I more or less have the idea of how things will shake out. And I'm going to give you a big spoiler alert right now. Obviously, we are going to be discussing major plot points within both the television show, House of the Dragon, and Fire and Blood, the novel. So there is your spoiler warning right there. One challenge I had while making this video was squaring the circle between Fire and Blood and House of the Dragon. For those of you who have read the novel, you know that the Dance of the Dragons is not told through a single narrative. Instead, it is a maester who is trying to piece together sources from the time in the dance and doing what he can to parse them out and figure out what's true and what's not. And I personally love this choice by Martin, as this is often how we in our real lives have to parse out our own history. We have scholars trying to figure out what happened by piecing together multiple, often contradictory sources, each of whom probably has their own agenda, which is rooted in the thinking of their own times and not necessarily our own. So one of the biggest questions I have is that, are the events of the House of the Dragon the quote-unquote true telling of the Dance of the Dragons? Or is this just another source that we add to the pile for comparison? In the novel, we have three sources that we continually refer to. We have Septon Eustace, who is generally considered to be pro-green. We have Grand Maester Munkin, who tries to take a more balanced middle-of-the-road approach. And then, of course, we have our good friend Mushroom, the 3-foot-tall dwarven jester who has graced the court of various Targaryen kings, but most importantly for us, both Viserys and Rhaenyra during the Dance of the Dragons. Mushroom is considered to be a pro-black source, as he was in Rhaenyra's direct company during the Dance of the Dragons. Unfortunately, Mushroom does not appear in the TV series, and this is a big disappointment for me personally, though I'm convinced the main reason why they cut him is because his member was simply too large to fit on screen. But let's return to our main question here. Are the events in the television show the true telling or just another source? For me personally, I'm going to put them in the extra source pile, which will be compared and contrasted with our other ones. I think it's very likely that the events of the television show could be events as told and recounted by Rhaenyra, but the only reason I really have for thinking this is that A, the show begins with her narration, and B, she generally comes off, at least in my opinion, better, and the black side comes off better in the television show than in the novel. Now, before we get to the Dance of the Dragons, we need to take a brief detour and talk about medieval succession, and inheritance law as it relates to our own history. Obviously, this is a key discussion when it comes to who has the legitimate claim for the Iron Throne, as it's pretty clear that George R.R. Martin based succession in Westeros off inheritance law in medieval England. Fancy schmancy political term for that being agnotic cagnotic primogeniture, sometimes shortened to just cagnotic primogeniture inherits. What this means in layman's terms is that the first child will inherit all lands and titles if they are male. However, the important part of our discussion is that under this inheritance law, if there are no male heirs or they have died without children, then the eldest daughter shall inherit all lands and titles, and then the daughter's children, and so on and so forth. This is important because it is the idea that the eldest child's line is the one that is the utmost importance in this inheritance law. The claims of the firstborn daughter come before any male uncles or cousins or other relatives in this regard. So basically, this is male preferred inheritance, but not male absolutist inheritance, which excludes females entirely from inheriting lands and titles. This is called male absolutism primogeniture, and this was practiced in some other kingdoms in medieval Europe. And now today, the royal family practices what is called absolute primogeniture, which is that the first child will inherit lands and titles regardless of their gender. Now, with that out of the way, we can return to Westeros, where the people practice cagnotic primogeniture inheritance. And there are numerous examples of females ruling great houses throughout Westerosi history. However, this is not necessarily an absolute law, but rather simply practiced tradition, as there are examples of uncles trying to press their claims for nieces' titles in Westeros. This is important to remember because there's no constitution in Westeros dictating the actions of executives and how they should pass their power down. It's all based on tradition, which is far more opaque than actual written law. While tradition is mostly adhered to, it is not always adhered to. So when asking who has the rightful claim in the Dance of the Dragons, we need to take a look at the core event which sparked conflict, which is the Great Council of 101 AC, led by Jaehaerys the Conciliator, the longest reigning and considered to be the wisest of all Targaryen kings. However, he made a great error in my opinion, and the show messed up greatly with this as well. In Fire and Blood, the Great Council is decided between Laenor and Viserys, not Viserys and Rhaenys as it is in the television show. At the time of the Great Council, Laenor is still quite young, so if he were to become king, he would almost certainly need regency and guidance. And given the tradition of cagnotic primogeniture in Westeros, the Iron Throne should have clearly gone to Laenor, with Rhaenys being the Dowager Queen and ruling in his stead until he came of age. And there are numerous times in which characters within House of the Dragon actually make reference to how this law was overturned, and this is what they're talking about when they make reference to that. So I think the true answer between the Greens and the Blacks is neither. If Jaehaerys had just followed the traditional laws of Westeros rather than holding the Great Council, it's much less likely that the Dance of the Dragons would have happened. For such a wise king, I always questioned his decision to hold this council. It was considered pretty much a done deal that the great lords of Westeros would vote for Viserys and the male line. So realistically, there was no reason to have this council whatsoever. The only reasons I can think of is that he was worried about the realm's stability under the regency of Rhaenys, plus Balon, the younger son of Jaehaerys, had two sons, which would give that side of the family greater stability. But it could simply be because he favored his grandsons more than his granddaughter. We simply cannot know. So don't worry, I have an actual answer, but I just wanted to make it clear that the event which sparked the Dance of the Dragons in the first place was against Westerosi tradition. Neither Rhaenyra nor Aegon would be the ruler of the Seven Kingdoms had tradition been followed in the first place. But now let's take things as they are, considering that the Great Council at the time of the Dance of Dragons is ancient history. So given what I've told you, if you've been paying attention, it's obvious that under traditional Westerosi laws, as soon as Viserys sired Aegon, Rhaenyra's claim would be passed to him.
Objection! Hold it! Take that!
There's one last key aspect here that we have to consider before making our informed and final decision. We need to consider the following question. How absolute is the king's word? As mentioned before, there is no constitution in Westeros, and thus no formal limits on the king's power. Yes, the king governs through levers of power, such as his small council, wardens, and other great lords, but for all intents and purposes, the king is an absolute dictator, and his word is law. The law of Targaryen exceptionalism has been in existence since Aegon's conquest. Targaryens are pretty much allowed to do whatever they want. Because of their Valyrian blood, they are considered to be on a plane above normal people. Targaryens intermarry within their own families, something which is considered a grievous sin in the Faith of the Seven. However, Targaryens were allowed to engage in this practice throughout their dynasty. It is important to note that there is some limits on Targaryen exceptionalism. For example, Aegon the Conqueror famously had his 2 sister wives. However, this practice was eventually phased out, primarily after the disastrous reign of Maegor the Cruel. That being said, incestuous marriages never phased out, and generally throughout Westerosi history, no matter how ridiculous the king's decree, it is considered to be the law of the land. Which brings us to Viserys. It's very clear he wished for Rhaenyra to be his heir, as he continually reaffirmed this all of his life, despite numerous opportunities to change his mind. So at this point, the question becomes whether or not you believe the king has the right to countermand tradition and dictate his law as he chooses. And I think it's clear that the king does have that power, as again, there are no handwritten rules outlining the king's limits regarding what he can and cannot do. Viserys was hardly the first Targaryen to violate tradition, and he certainly won't be the last. However, that doesn't mean there are no checks and balances to the king. They do exist, but they are in the realm of soft power and influence, not hard dictated law. A crafty statesman understands this. Unfortunately, Viserys was not a crafty statesman, and did not understand how others would use soft power to undermine his dictates. Despite Viserys continually affirming Rhaenyra as his heir, he did very little to prepare and protect her for the job, and gave her almost nothing in terms of actual power. While being the Princess of Dragonstone does give Rhaenyra certain legitimacy and power, Dragonstone itself has very little to do with ruling the realm as a whole. Rhaenyra got almost no time to sit on the Iron Throne, mete out judgments, and actually rule. She never had a position on the Small Council, which would allow her to understand the important aspects of statecraft. And then, strangest of all, Viserys gave power back to the people who were directly opposed to his long-term interest. The best course of action for him would have been to make Rhaenyra his hand after Lyonel Strong's death in 121 AC. Instead, he gave the badge back to Otto Hightower, a man who he already suspects of angling to place his grandson on the throne against his wishes, which then, of course, Otto does exactly that. He spent the time packing the Small Council with his own hand-picked loyalists, and used his position to lay the groundwork for his eventual coup. If Rhaenyra had been hanged during this time, Otto would have had no power or capability to eventually lay these plans, making a Dance of the Dragon scenario much harder. Yes, the king's word is law, but there will always be those who work to undermine it. Viserys was a kind and trusting man who wanted to see the goodness in the people around him. An example of this was the fact that he had no Master of Whispers during his reign. He just assumed that no one would work to undermine him or his goals. He thought that as king, everyone would just go along with him. And unfortunately, that simply was not the case. I think the question of who has the rightful claim comes down to asking yourself one thing, which is that do you believe the king's word overrides tradition? And I think it's pretty clear that given in the past of Westerosi history, and as we know what is going to happen in the future, Targaryen kings will violate traditions over and over and over again. So for me personally, I do believe the king of Westeros, for all intents and purposes, is an absolute dictator, and whatever they say, is effectively law. Therefore, that makes Rhaenyra the one who has the rightful claim. Some argue that this question goes back to an established precedent which was created in the Great Council, but I personally don't think that this is the case, as again, I really dislike the way the television show sets up the Great Council. They set it up as a question of whether or not the lords want a man or woman on the Iron Throne. In the books, it's more of a question of which side of the Targaryen dynasty is going to carry the torch in the future. It's not like this kind of weird gender war or something. And because of that, I don't see the Great Council as establishing a precedent, but more it was a decision of who was going to get that torch. The last argument I want to discuss is an argument of who has the rightful claim based on personality or character traits, or who would be the best leader. Honestly, this doesn't matter at all, because we are thinking about this from our modern perspectives, almost like this is an election between two candidates. But that's not how monarchies work. Whoever is next in line inherits the throne, regardless of what type of person they happen to be. For those of you who have played Crusader Kings, you know the curse of the monarchy dice throw. Sometimes you get a Charlemagne, and the next time you get a Caligula. This is inherent within dynastic monarchical systems. So when it comes to a discussion of who has the better character, Rhaenyra or Aegon, it's completely irrelevant to who has the actual right to claim the throne. If we do go down that road, I think it's clear that both faction leaders have serious disadvantages and advantages, and you can make arguments for either one of them until the Ravens come home. But if you want me to make some sort of definitive statement here, I do think that Rhaenyra edges out Aegon. Aegon, as depicted in the television show, is the worst. He would be an absolute dreadful king. Rhaenyra is certainly portrayed better than him. However, she too has a myriad of personality flaws that would make her a rather average monarch on the scale of things. Some attacks against her are certainly well-deserved, while others are weird. One of the weirdest ones I see is calling Rhaenyra entitled. Yes, how dare she feel entitled to the thing her father told her she was entitled to literally her entire life. What a bitch, that Queen Elizabeth, thinking she was entitled to become the Queen of England. Fuck her. Aegon too is portrayed worse than he comes across in Fire and Blood. There are many contradictory reports about the king and his character within the novel. Septon Eustace, for example, takes a very pro-Aegon lot. He outlines some of his character flaws, but he definitely focuses more on things like cares about his kids and blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, Mushroom thinks he's the worst human being of all, that he's the devil, he's awful, and he's a big piece of shit. So, again, there are two faces of Aegon, depending on which source you want to go with. But ultimately, I can mash them all together and come up with a mean average. And I think in the mean average, Aegon would probably be a below average king. Ultimately, though, the layers of complexity and contradictory standards and laws make for a very compelling story. One which is extremely enjoyable to talk about and speculate on. This is one of those true debates where I think there really isn't a good guy or bad guy. You can make excellent cases for either side. And this is probably why the story generates so much discussion. So whether you are a Game of Thrones super nerd or casual enjoyer of the series, I hope you found this video interesting and informative. That's all I got to say on the matter for now, and I look forward to reading your opinions in the comments. Until next time, this has been the Comrade, signing off for now, and you guys take care.